On today's episode of Wengel's Workshop, I'll be making a drop point hunting knife. On this channel, I tell the story behind various knife builds. If that sounds like something that would interest you, please consider subscribing. For this build, I'll be using 1084 high carbon steel. So far, I've coated it in layout fluid and traced my template onto the steel. I'm actually going to be making a batch of 5 of these knives, simply just to practice knife making. Using an angle grinder, I'll cut some of the bigger chunks of steel away from the knife and then cut the knife off the bar stock, and then I'll head over to my 2x72 grinder to finish profiling the knife. I always finish profiling the knife by grinding the edges parallel to the length of the knife, and this just makes it easier to mark my layout lines for the bevels. Now I'll roughly mark out where the scales will be so that I can mark out the pinholes and the weight reduction holes. I'll center punch everything and then head over to the drill press to remove the material. Once I'm done at the drill press, I will use the 2-inch wheel on my grinder to put some fullers in the tang, and this is also just to reduce weight. Once I'm done with the fullers, I will surface grind the knife to remove any of the burrs and make sure that the surfaces are flat going into the bevel layout. Now I'll use some layout fluid and a couple of drill bits to mark out the center line for the main bevel and the false bevel. I'll grind the bulk of my main bevel using a 40 grit belt, and then I'll move up to an 80 grit and then eventually a 150 and a 220 grit belt. For the false bevels, I believe I started with a 150 grit and then finished at a 220. So here's the result, sanded up through 220 grit. Now with the false bevels, since they're not very wide, it's hard to get them perfectly flat, so I will draw file them flat and then sand them back down. Now I'll file in some jimping using a checkering file where you would place your thumb on the spine of the knife. Now it's time to heat treat the knife. I will use a chain to heat up the quench oil to the proper temperature, and then I will bring the knife to non-magnetic twice and then let it cool in the air, helping the knife to normalize, and then I'll bring it to non-magnetic and I will quench the knife. Once the knife is quenched, I will temper the knife in my oven 2 cycles at 400 degrees for 2 hours. And here's what the knife looks like after that. Now I'll spend some time on the grinder, bringing both bevels and the flat surfaces up to 400 grit, and then I'll hit everything with the surface conditioning belt prior to doing the acid etch. The acid that I'm using to etch the knife is ferric chloride, and after I etch it and then neutralize the acid, I will stonewash the knife. Now I forgot to record stonewashing the knife, but here is an image of the final result after it was acid etched and stonewashed. Now I'll clamp the scales together and clamp them to the knife and go ahead and drill the pinholes. For the scales, I used African blackwood with a red liner. Once the pinholes are drilled, I will flush trim the scales to the profile of the knife, and then I will glue them onto the knife. And now here is the knife after the scales are glued on. Now I'll grind the pins flush to the knife and then clean up all the edges of the knife and head back over to the router table to use a roundover bit to start the shaping of the scales. Once I'm done shaping the scales, I will hand sand them from 150 grit up through 600 grit. Now I use a buffing wheel and some white buffing compound to polish the scales up. And now the last thing to do is sharpen the knife. I will start with a 150 grit belt on my grinder. I'll establish the bevel in an even burr along the entire edge, and then I'll work it up through 400 grit. I will take it to a honing rod, and then I'll strop the knife. After that, the knife should be sharp. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. And if you want to be notified when I upload new videos, make sure to hit the notification bell. You could also follow me on Instagram to see pictures of the builds prior to posting the videos. And as always, thanks for watching.